the night of June 11th, 1962. On a dark, foggy evening, a daring escape was unfolding on one of the most notorious islands in the world, the infamous Alcatraz prison. For decades, this high-security island had been home to some of the most dangerous criminals in the United States, surrounded by the cold, treacherous waters of the San Francisco Bay. But as the clock struck midnight, something extraordinary was happening. Frank Morris, along with brothers John and Clarence Anglin, had a plan, an audacious plan that, if successful, would see them vanish without a trace. Alcatraz was considered escape-proof. The prison's isolation, the strong currents, and the sharp cliffs surrounding it made it seem like an impenetrable fortress. The guards knew it, the prisoners knew it, and yet Frank, John, and Clarence believed otherwise. They had spent months meticulously planning their escape, using nothing but their wits and determination. They had to outsmart the guards, the surveillance system, and the unforgiving waters. What began as a simple idea slowly grew into an elaborate operation. Over weeks, the three men carved away at their cell's walls, covering up the holes during the day and working at night. They fashioned makeshift tools from toothbrushes and metal scraps. They even created lifelike dummy heads to fool the guards during bed checks. The sheer ingenuity behind their escape was incredible, and it worked. By the time the guards noticed anything amiss, it was too late. But what happened next? Did they make it to freedom, or did their daring escape end in tragedy? As the escape plan came to fruition, the mystery deepened. What exactly happened to Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin after they vanished into the night? To this day, no one knows for sure. The case remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Over the years, numerous theories have surfaced, some claiming the escapees made it to freedom, others suggesting they perished in the bay. The authorities never found conclusive proof of what happened, and the men's fates remain shrouded in uncertainty. Every year, new details emerge, fueling public fascination with their story. But after more than 60 years, one question still haunts us. Did they survive, or did they fall victim to the cold waters of the bay? In the next part of this story, we'll dive deeper into the details of their escape, the investigation that followed, and the theories that have kept people guessing all these years. Was this the perfect escape, or did the men meet a tragic end? Stick with us, because the mystery of Alcatraz is far from over. Alcatraz was never meant to be an ordinary prison. Located in the cold, unforgiving waters of San Francisco Bay, it was designed to house the most dangerous criminals, the ones who couldn't be kept in regular prisons. The government believed that no one could escape from Alcatraz. The rocky island was surrounded by fierce currents, sharp cliffs, and chilling waters. Guards watched from every tower, keeping a close eye on the inmates. For years, it seemed like the prison's reputation was enough to prevent anyone from even thinking about escape. But in the summer of 1962, three men proved that even the most fortified prison could be outsmarted. Frank Morris, the mastermind behind the escape, was no stranger to trouble. Born in 1926 in Washington, D.C., he had spent most of his life on the wrong side of the law. He was intelligent and resourceful, though, and those qualities made him both a challenge and a threat to the authorities. Over the years, Frank had been arrested several times for crimes such as bank robbery, but it was his time at Alcatraz that truly made him infamous. Known for being difficult to manage, he had spent a significant amount of his time at Alcatraz in solitary confinement. His time in isolation did not break him, though. If anything, it gave him the focus and determination to plan his greatest escape. John Anglin and his younger brother Clarence were no strangers to crime either. Born into a poor family in Georgia, the Anglin brothers grew up surrounded by poverty and hardship. By the time they were adults, they had both been convicted of multiple crimes, including robbery. It was in the 1950s that they, along with Frank Morris, found themselves locked away in the cells of Alcatraz. Despite the harsh conditions of the prison, the three men formed a bond. They shared a desire to escape, to leave behind the prison that held them in a cold grip. For months, the three men secretly planned their escape. It was no easy feat. They were constantly watched by guards, and their cells were examined frequently. But Frank, John, and Clarence were patient. They knew the prison's routines and weaknesses better than anyone. They had to. Every movement was calculated, every action planned with precision. The walls of their cells were made of solid concrete, but they were also old. The cracks in the structure were small, but noticeable if you knew where to look. It was there, in those cracks, that their escape began. At night, when the prison fell silent, the men would scrape away at the concrete with crude tools made from whatever they could find. Toothbrushes, spoons, and other objects that could be repurposed into makeshift instruments of freedom. Over time, the holes in their cells grew larger. But it wasn't just about breaking through the walls. No, the real challenge was what lay beyond their cells. The narrow corridors, the thick metal doors, the bars that separated them from the outside world. They had to figure out how to get past all of that too. It wasn't just the physical barriers that posed a threat. There was also the constant fear of being caught. Every night, Frank, John, and Clarence had to act as though they were still in their cells, sleeping soundly. They crafted lifelike dummies from sheets, paper mache, and other materials to trick the guards into thinking they were still inside. It was a delicate balancing act. If one of the dummies shifted or looked out of place, the whole plan would be ruined. But their efforts were meticulous, and for the most part, the guards never suspected a thing. By the time the night of June 11 arrived, everything was in place. Frank, John, and Clarence had worked tirelessly to prepare for this moment. They had cut through the vents of their cells and used the small holes to access the prison's utility corridors. They crawled through these dark, cramped spaces, sneaking their way toward the roof. The escape route was a perilous one, but it was their only chance. Once on the roof, they knew they would have to make it across the prison's perimeter and get to the water's edge. From there, they had no idea whether they would survive the cold, dangerous waters of the bay, but it was their only shot. The men were determined to make it. They crafted rafts out of raincoats, sewing them together with thread they had taken from the prison's laundry room. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all they had. At midnight, when the prison's night shift began, they put their plan into action. With quiet, calculated movements, they crawled through the vents and made their way to the roof. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the island as they silently moved toward the edge. Their hearts raced, the sound of their footsteps barely audible over the crashing waves below. But as they began to descend into the water, the first signs of trouble appeared. The currents were stronger than they anticipated, pulling at them, making the rafts harder to control. Every stroke through the water was a battle against the tides. With the island growing smaller in the distance, Frank, John, and Clarence pushed forward, not knowing if they would survive the journey, or if anyone would ever know what had happened to them. Back at the prison, the next morning brought nothing but confusion and fear. When the guards came to check on the prisoners, they found their cells empty. The lifelike dummies had fooled them, but now there was no sign of the three men. An alarm was sounded, and an immediate search was launched. The authorities combed the island, searching for any trace of the escapees. They scoured the bay, hoping to find the men clinging to life, but they found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, just the empty silence of Alcatraz. As the days turned into weeks, the mystery only deepened. No one knew where the men had gone, or if they had even made it to the shore. Was it possible that they had drowned in the cold waters? Could they have made it to freedom, escaping into the shadows of San Francisco? And if they had, why had they never contacted anyone, never left behind a clue? The investigation dragged on, but no solid evidence ever surfaced. The case remained cold, with more questions than answers. Frank, John, and Clarence became legends. Their escape the subject of countless books, movies, and documentaries. Some believed they had made it to freedom and were living under new identities. Others speculated that they had perished in the bay, their bodies never found. Whatever the truth was, it seemed impossible to uncover, and the mystery of what happened to them still haunts us today. What did the men experience that night? Did they survive, or did they fall victim to the harsh waters? As we continue to explore their escape, we'll take a deeper look at the many theories surrounding their fate. Could they have outsmarted the prison, or did the bay claim their lives? One thing is for sure, the mystery of their disappearance is far from over. The escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers left behind more questions than answers. The authorities were desperate to figure out what had happened to them. Was it possible they had actually made it to the mainland? Or had they drowned in the cold, choppy waters of the bay? There were so many theories, but nothing that could provide definitive answers. The search continued for weeks, but every lead turned up empty, deepening the mystery. One of the more shocking aspects of the whole situation was how the authorities were caught off guard. For all the security Alcatraz had, no one had ever anticipated such a bold, meticulous escape. The prison was designed with escape-proof measures in mind, but Frank, John, and Clarence had managed to exploit every flaw, no matter how small. The ventilation system, the roof, the guard rotations, it was all carefully studied and turned to their advantage. The escape wasn't just a simple act of running away. It was a brilliant plan that required patience, skill, and incredible resourcefulness. As investigators began to analyze the escape in more detail, they realized how close the three men had come to making it. The makeshift rafts, crafted from raincoats, were their final shot at freedom. But what happened after they left the island? Did they even make it to the shore, or did the currents drag them under before they could even reach safety? The authorities looked into the possibility of them having been swept away by the treacherous tides, but there was no evidence to confirm that either. No bodies were found, no traces of the men washed ashore. In the following months, rumors began to swirl. Some believed the men had made it to San Francisco and disappeared into the city's sprawling neighborhoods. Others thought they had gone to Mexico, or perhaps even further south, using their criminal connections to establish new identities. If they had escaped, the question remained: why didn't they contact anyone? Why didn't they try to send word to their families, or seek a life free from the constant threat of being caught? One of the most persistent theories was that the escapees had actually made it to freedom, but they were living under new identities, hiding in plain sight. After all, Frank and the Anglins were known for their ability to blend in. Frank had spent years on the run before his capture, and the Anglin brothers had a history of using aliases and disappearing for long stretches. Could they have used their skills once again to vanish into the fabric of society, leaving behind only whispers of their escape? The possibility was tantalizing, but the lack of any hard evidence made it difficult to accept as the truth. At the same time, the investigation into their disappearance had taken a more dark and tragic turn. As the months turned into years, it became apparent that the authorities were not just looking for missing men. They were also searching for bodies. The Bay had claimed its fair share of victims over the years, and it seemed possible that the currents had taken Frank and the Anglins as well. Even though the men had crafted rafts, no one could say for certain if they had survived the dangerous journey across the bay. And with no bodies to provide answers, the mystery only deepened. The fact that no one could definitively say what happened to them left a cloud of suspicion over the entire case. Were the men simply victims of nature's ruthless power? Or did they somehow manage to survive and disappear without a trace? The silence from the escapees themselves was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire story. If they had indeed survived, why did they not return to their families? What kept them from reaching out, even in secret? This silence fueled even more theories. Some claimed that Frank and the Anglins had been forced to stay silent because of a deal with outside contacts, perhaps criminals who helped them get to safety in exchange for their loyalty or silence. Others believed that the men had started new lives, but were so deeply involved in their new identities that they simply had no interest in going back to their old lives. And still, there were others who believed the men might have lived out their days in the shadows, haunted by their escape, never willing to reveal the truth for fear of being caught. Throughout the years, the mystery of Alcatraz has become a fixture in popular culture. Books, documentaries, and even movies have explored the possibility of the escapees' survival, and yet each new telling only raises more questions. Was it the perfect escape, or was it a tragic failure? The fact that we still don't know the answers is part of what makes it so captivating. But as the investigation continued to unfold, one thing became clearer: the authorities were not about to let this go. They kept hoping that new information would emerge, or that someone would slip up. They weren't willing to write off the case as an unsolved mystery. For them, the question of what happened to Frank and the Anglins was more than just a matter of solving a crime. It was a matter of pride. They couldn't accept the idea that the three men might have outsmarted them, escaped their watchful eyes, and disappeared without a trace. So the search continued, sometimes with new vigor, sometimes with the reluctant acknowledgement that they might never find the answers. But there were still those who believed that Frank, John, and Clarence were out there somewhere. They hadn't given up on the idea that the escapees had made it. And yet, as each new year passed without a confirmed sighting, it seemed increasingly likely that the mystery of Alcatraz would remain unsolved. Could the men have truly escaped? Or was the whole thing a carefully crafted illusion? A brilliant, daring attempt at freedom that ultimately ended in failure? The authorities continued to investigate, but the case grew colder with each passing year. Even as new theories emerged, the mystery of Alcatraz, the fate of Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, remained a puzzle that no one could solve. And so the questions linger. What really happened that night? Did they make it? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did they leave no trace behind? As we delve deeper into the mystery, one thing is certain. The story of their escape is far from over. As the years went on, the mystery of the escape from Alcatraz seemed to take on a life of its own. The authorities had all but exhausted their leads, but the case was far from closed. There were moments when it felt like the walls of silence were closing in, and no matter how much they dug, no new evidence would emerge. But then, just when it seemed like the truth would remain buried, a strange piece of information surfaced, a whisper that would reignite the flames of curiosity and hope. A letter, sent anonymously, arrived at the office of a retired FBI agent. The letter contained only a few words, but they were enough to send chills down the agent's spine. I know what happened to them. The handwriting was untraceable, the paper old, like it had been tucked away for years. But the words carried weight. Could it be true? Could someone finally be coming forward with information that could solve the mystery? The agent was cautious, hesitant even, but curiosity got the better of him. He knew he had to pursue this lead, even if it seemed like just another dead end. The letter sent ripples through the investigative community. Over the following months, other fragments of information surfaced, each more puzzling than the last. Witnesses came forward, some claiming to have seen men who resembled Frank, John, and Clarence in various locations. San Francisco, Mexico, even as far as South America. Were these sightings legitimate? Or were they just part of the growing mythology that had surrounded the escape for decades? What made these new leads even more intriguing was the fact that many of them seemed to be connected to the criminal world. Could the men have found help from former associates, people who had managed to hide them in plain sight? The theory gained traction as investigators pieced together the puzzle of their past. Frank, John, and Clarence were no strangers to the underground world. They had connections, people who might have aided their escape in exchange for silence or for favors down the line. But how far would these connections stretch? Were they still out there, willing to protect the men even after all these years? The tension surrounding the case reached a boiling point. The FBI's renewed investigation began to dig deeper into these theories, retracing the steps of every lead, no matter how small. They combed through old criminal records, speaking to former associates of the escapees, trying to find the missing link that could explain it all. And then, just when they thought they might have stumbled onto something substantial, another wrench was thrown into the works, an unsettling discovery that would turn the investigation on its head. A series of photographs surfaced, showing a man believed to be Frank Morris, standing next to a group of people in a distant country. The photo was grainy, blurry, and from an unknown source, but the likeness was undeniable. The man in the photo had the same striking features, the same look of defiance in his eyes. Could this be Frank? Was it possible that he had truly escaped and lived for years under a new identity? The authorities were left with more questions than ever before. At the same time, new forensic evidence seemed to suggest that the men had indeed managed to survive the perilous journey across the bay. A deep dive into historical records revealed that an unidentified set of fingerprints had been found near the Golden Gate Bridge shortly after the escape. They didn't match any known suspects at the time, but now, more than half a century later, the fingerprints were being re-examined. Could they be the missing link? The connection that would finally solve the case? It was a tantalizing possibility, but no one could say for sure. The evidence was circumstantial, and the trail was too cold to follow with any certainty. As the investigators dug deeper, they also started to question the motives behind the escape. Frank, John, and Clarence had risked everything for the chance at freedom. But what would they do with that freedom if they achieved it? Would they have gone straight to the authorities, seeking a new life in the open? Or had they fallen into a life of crime once again, relying on their past connections to keep them hidden from the law? No one could answer that question, but the stakes were higher now than ever before. With each new development, the stakes seemed to rise. The possibility of finding the escapees alive, or even finding their final resting place, became more and more real. Yet, there was always something in the back of everyone's mind, something they couldn't shake, the nagging feeling that perhaps the truth was something even darker than anyone had anticipated. In the midst of all this, a series of cryptic phone calls began to arrive. The voice on the other end was always the same, deep, rough, and difficult to understand. The caller claimed to know the fate of the three men, but every time the investigator pressed for more information, the caller would hang up. It was as if someone was toying with them, drawing out the mystery, keeping the tension alive. These calls only deepened the frustration and anticipation. Who was behind them? Were they just a prank, or was this person a key witness, one who knew something no one else did? The frustration mounted. Each time a new lead came in, it was met with a mix of excitement and skepticism. Could they really be close to finding the truth? Or was this just another false hope, another dead end? The weight of uncertainty grew heavier with every passing day, and the question loomed large. Would the world ever truly know what happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers? Had they escaped to a new life, or had they perished in the cold waters of the bay? The truth seemed just out of reach, and yet, everyone felt that it was waiting to be uncovered, if only someone could make the right connection. The night grew darker, the winds colder. The investigation was reaching its breaking point. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. Were they getting too close to something someone wanted to keep buried? Would they uncover a secret that could change everything, or would they be left with nothing but more questions? Every clue seemed to bring them closer to a revelation, but nothing was certain. And so, with bated breath, everyone waited. The story of Alcatraz's most famous escape was about to reach its climax, but what would that climax reveal? The mystery was still alive, and it was only a matter of time before the next twist would emerge. Just when it seemed like the investigation into the fate of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had reached a breaking point, a new twist came to light. One that no one could have anticipated. Late one evening, a mysterious package arrived at the FBI's office. It was unmarked, no return address, and had clearly been sent without any intention of revealing its source. Inside, there was a tattered envelope, worn from age, and a single piece of paper. The handwriting was scrawled in ink that had long since faded, but the words on the paper were enough to make the investigators pause. It was a confession. Not from one of the escapees themselves, but from someone claiming to have helped them. The letter described the escape in vivid detail, recounting the precise steps Frank, John, and Clarence had taken to break free from the island prison. But there was something else in the letter, something that chilled everyone to the core. The writer claimed that the men had not made it across the bay. Instead, they had been caught by a secret group of individuals, people who were willing to do anything to ensure that the escape remained unsolved. The letter described how Frank and the Anglins had been ambushed just after leaving the island, how they were forcibly taken by this shadowy group, their fates sealed in a different kind of prison. The group, it claimed, had deep ties to criminal organizations and had been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. They wanted to keep the escape a secret, and they were willing to eliminate anyone who came too close to the truth. The letter's author claimed that he had been one of the few to escape the group's grip. But now, for fear of his own life, he was ready to tell everything. The authorities were stunned. This new revelation turned everything they thought they knew about the case on its head. Could it really be true? Could Frank and the Anglin brothers have been part of something far bigger than anyone had ever imagined? The idea that they hadn't escaped to freedom but had been captured by a criminal syndicate was terrifying. If the men had been taken by this shadowy group, it meant that the investigation had barely scratched the surface of a much darker and more dangerous conspiracy. As investigators worked to verify the authenticity of the letter, they began to dig into this new angle, following leads that led them to some of the most dangerous criminals in the world. They reached out to former underworld figures, people who might have knowledge of the group described in the letter. It wasn't long before they realized that the group wasn't just a few rogue individuals. It was an entire network, one that spanned across multiple countries and had been operating under the radar for years. The implications were staggering. If Frank and the Anglins had been taken by this group, it meant they hadn't just escaped Alcatraz. They had been pulled into a much larger web of crime, deception, and secrecy. And worse, it meant that the authorities had been blind to the true scope of the escape all along. What had started as a daring prison break now appeared to be a pawn in a much greater game, one that involved powerful people with the means and the motivation to keep the truth hidden forever. The new leads were frightening, but they also offered a glimmer of hope. If Frank and the Anglins had been taken by this group, there was still a chance that they were alive. If they were being kept in hiding, it was possible they were still being protected. But as the investigators began to follow these threads, they quickly realized that they were in over their heads. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. There were whispers of disappearances, strange encounters, and threats made to anyone who got too close to the truth. It was clear that this was no longer just a case of a prison break. It was something much more sinister, something that had far-reaching consequences. The more they uncovered, the more they understood that there were people who would stop at nothing to keep the escapees' fate a secret. The stakes had never been higher. If Frank and the Anglins were alive, if they were being held by this group, then the authorities had to act quickly. But the closer they got to the truth, the more they realized that they were up against an adversary who knew how to cover its tracks, who had the resources and the ruthlessness to protect its secrets. The tension built to a fever pitch as the investigation reached its climax. Time was running out, and every moment felt like a race against an unseen enemy. The authorities were walking a fine line, one misstep away from triggering something far worse than they could have imagined. The possibility that Frank and the Anglins had survived and were being kept hidden was tantalizing. But it also meant that the investigation was delving into dangerous territory that could cost them everything. The question was no longer just whether the men had escaped. It was whether they had been trapped in a world far more dangerous than Alcatraz itself. Were they victims of a larger conspiracy? Had they been pawns in a game they never understood? And if they were still alive, how much longer could they remain hidden? The clock was ticking and the walls were closing in. The truth, it seemed, was more elusive than ever. But one thing was certain. The deeper they dug, the more complicated and terrifying the story became. The investigation had reached its boiling point. After months of sifting through obscure leads, dead ends, and cryptic messages, the authorities were finally closing in on something. They had traced the shadowy criminal network mentioned in the mysterious letter, and they were getting closer to uncovering the truth about Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. The weight of the case had grown too heavy for them to ignore, and everyone involved could feel the urgency in the air. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, like a sudden flash of lightning in a storm. A former associate of the criminal network, a man known only as Red, had been picked up on a routine surveillance check. He was a small-time criminal who had once worked with the group rumored to have taken the escapees. Red, however, had grown tired of the life he had once led. He was desperate to cut ties and disappear for good, and he was willing to talk. The FBI, knowing how crucial this information could be, played their cards carefully, drawing him into a meeting. Red sat nervously across from the agents, his hands trembling. He didn't know where to begin, or if he even wanted to continue, but the pressure of the situation was clear. When the agents finally pressed him on what he knew about the disappearance of Frank and the Anglins, Red's face went pale. His voice shook as he started to speak, revealing the terrifying truth that no one had anticipated. Frank and the Anglins hadn't been ambushed by a criminal syndicate. They hadn't been hidden away in some dark corner of the world. No, what had really happened was far more twisted. The escapees had been taken, but not by criminals looking to keep them as assets. Instead, they had been captured by a secret government program. A program so classified that even the people involved in it had no idea how deep the conspiracy went. Frank, John, and Clarence had been subjects of an experiment, part of a covert operation that involved manipulating the lives of prisoners for national security purposes. The revelation was shocking. For years, authorities had been under the assumption that the escape had been a simple act of defiance and desperation, but it turned out that the three men had unwittingly become pawns in a much larger game. They had been snatched from the streets after their escape and were forced into a life they never could have imagined. Their identities erased, their whereabouts classified. For decades, the program had operated in the shadows, keeping them locked away in a facility so secret that even the highest-ranking officials in the government had never known its exact location. As the truth began to unfold, the agents were left in disbelief. How could something so insidious be allowed to happen? How had these men been taken from the public eye and subjected to such an inhumane fate? But even as Red spilled the details, a new sense of urgency filled the room. The information Red had given them was valuable, but it was incomplete. There was still one crucial detail that he couldn't provide: the location of the facility where Frank and the Anglins had been held. That information, Red explained, was buried deep within the organization, and it was locked behind a series of layers so thick that even he couldn't get through them. The clock was ticking. The mystery that had consumed investigators for decades was now on the verge of a breakthrough, but they were still missing a vital piece of the puzzle. They had the knowledge, the names, the clues, but the facility's exact whereabouts remained hidden. It was a final hurdle that would either bring resolution or forever shroud the case in darkness. With no time to waste, the authorities launched a massive effort to track down any remaining leads. They combed through government archives, re-examined classified documents, and interviewed former officials who had worked in the intelligence community during the time the program had been active. The search was relentless, the stakes higher than ever before. But just when it seemed like they might be close, an unexpected twist occurred. One of the agents working the case, someone who had been at the forefront of the investigation from the beginning, uncovered a strange anomaly in the paperwork, something that had slipped through the cracks for years. It was a single line in a report, buried under layers of bureaucracy, detailing a failed attempt to locate a group of prisoners who had disappeared following a failed escape. The report mentioned a secret operation called Phoenix Wing, a name that was linked to Frank and the Anglins. The operation had been scrubbed from the official records, but this one fragment of evidence suggested that the escapees had been relocated to a hidden, underground compound, one that didn't even exist on any map. With the discovery of Phoenix Wing, everything fell into place. The agents had their location, and they rushed to follow the lead, hoping that they could finally get to the bottom of the mystery. But just as they prepared to make their move, something completely unexpected happened. The location they had tracked down, the very place they believed held the answers to everything, had been wiped clean. No evidence, no trace, nothing remained. The building, once thought to house the secret facility, was now nothing but an empty lot. The truth, if there ever was one, was gone, erased as if it had never existed. The only thing left behind was a chilling message, written on a piece of paper that had been left on the floor of the now abandoned site. The truth is what you make it. No one knew what to make of it. The mystery of Alcatraz and its most infamous escape had been cracked open, only for the final piece to vanish before anyone could reach it. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, were they alive? Still hidden away? Had they been erased from history, never to be found? The mystery in the end was not just about where they had gone, but about the darkness that had protected them, a darkness that was perhaps too vast to fully understand. As the agents walked away from the empty lot, the words from the cryptic message echoed in their minds. What was the truth, and who controlled it? In the end, it seemed the mystery would remain forever unresolved. And maybe that was the most haunting thing of all. The empty lot where the secret facility once stood became a symbol of all that had been left behind, an enigma that would never truly be solved. As the agents stood there, staring at the barren ground where so many answers should have been, a feeling of disbelief hung heavy in the air. It was as if the final puzzle piece had slipped through their fingers, vanishing without a trace. The years of investigation, the countless hours spent tracking down leads, had all led them to this single haunting conclusion. The truth, whatever it was, had been buried so deeply that even those who searched for it could never uncover it. The disappearance of Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin would remain one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. What had happened to them? Had they truly escaped, only to vanish without a trace? Or had they been swept into a web of government secrecy and shadowy conspiracies, their fates forever locked away in the vaults of a hidden operation? There were no concrete answers, just fragments, rumors, and whispers that would never fully piece together into a coherent story. And yet, even as the agents walked away from the lot, they couldn't shake the sense that the case was still alive, still out there somewhere. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that the true mystery wasn't about finding the men. It was about understanding the forces that had kept their story hidden for so long. The cover-up, the manipulation of records, the erasure of evidence, it all pointed to a bigger picture, one that no one had been able to see until now. The government, the criminal networks, the web of lies, they were all part of a much larger, more complex narrative that had been obscured for decades. In the weeks that followed, the story of the escapees took on a life of its own. News outlets, both local and national, picked up on the latest developments, reporting on the shocking revelations that had surfaced. The theories about their escape had been turned on their heads, and the public couldn't get enough of it. People were fascinated by the mystery, captivated by the idea that there were still unanswered questions about the fate of Frank, John, and Clarence. But amidst the media frenzy, there were those who saw the larger implications of the case. The investigation into the escape had inadvertently uncovered something far more disturbing: the extent to which power, secrecy, and control could manipulate the lives of ordinary people. Frank and the Anglins had been pawns in a game they didn't even understand, caught between the forces of government secrecy and criminal influence. Their escape, which had once seemed like a simple act of desperation, was now a window into a world where truth was hidden, and the people who controlled it had the power to shape history. For the families of the escapees, the revelations were both painful and cathartic. The Anglin brothers' family, who had long believed in their innocence and yearned for closure, were left grappling with the reality that their loved ones might never be found. Frank Morris's family, too, struggled with the unknown. But there was a sense of peace in knowing that the story had been heard, that the world now understood that their loved ones were not just criminals. They were men who had been caught in a much larger, more complex story than anyone had ever imagined. The families were left to mourn, but also to remember the men for their daring attempt at freedom, even if that freedom was never fully realized. As time passed, the case began to fade into the background of history, becoming a distant memory for most. But for those who had followed the investigation, the story of the Alcatraz escape remained an open wound, a mystery that refused to close. It was the kind of story that would be passed down through generations, one of those great unsolved riddles that would forever stir the imagination, making people wonder if Frank, John, and Clarence had truly escaped to freedom, or if they had become something far greater than they could have ever imagined. The mystery of Alcatraz, it seemed, was a story without an ending, one that could never be fully understood, but always felt. It wasn't just about three men who had tried to break free. It was about the idea of escape itself and what it means to seek freedom in a world that constantly tries to keep you confined. The legacy of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers would live on, not because of the answers to their fate, but because of the questions they left behind. And perhaps, in the end, that was the most fitting conclusion of all. The story of their escape wasn't just about the destination. It was about the journey, the struggle, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to be broken, no matter how many walls stand in its way. As the years turned into decades, the mystery would never fully fade. People would continue to speculate, to search for the truth, to ask whether the men had survived or had perished in the waters of the bay. But the key takeaway from the story was not the answer. It was the reminder that the pursuit of freedom, no matter how elusive, is a force that drives people to risk everything. And in the case of Frank, John, and Clarence, that pursuit would live on in the hearts of those who still believed that, somewhere out there, the truth remained just beyond the horizon.